Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started as people start to trickle in. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to Nucleate Translate. My name is Julia Pian. I'm a resident physician in pediatrics at Boston Children's and Boston Medical Center. Along with Sayo Eweje, I'm Co-VP of Nucleate's clinical operations. Before we hand it to our featured speaker tonight, Dr. Stehman-Breen, I'd like to give those new to the organization a brief insight into Nucleate and Nucleate Translate. So Nucleate is a biotech educational nonprofit. We aim to empower tomorrow's biotech leaders by educating today's academic trainees. We're active in 20 regions, representing over 120 universities across the US, UK, and EU. And our flagship activator program has produced 108 startup teams that have raised over $170 million in funding after the program. In its mission to democratize biotech education, Nucleate also runs a variety of educational programs. And today I am so excited to launch Nucleate Translate. It's an open access lecture series for you all here that's by physicians to help future biotech leaders understand the fundamentals of clinical development and how to make a positive impact on clinical practice. As a physician myself, I believe strongly that any biotech venture should be thinking concretely about how they can better patient lives from day one. And I know that clinicians of all backgrounds or anyone with direct patient experience has valuable insights to share with early biotech entrepreneurs and ventures. I'm also just really excited to feature some incredible physicians in biopharma who I look up to as role models and mentors, and we get to give the spotlight to here. So we'll be Nucleate Translate. We're going to try and give you all the tools and the vocabulary to bridge the clinical world to biotech ventures. We planned a 5-session series this year, starting with today's lecture on unmet needs and indication selection. And then our next sessions will cover biomarkers and translational medicine, regulatory interactions, clinical development, and then careers in biopharma for clinicians. And we'll be sending out information and giving you more info in a preview later. Without further delay, I'd like to pass it to my colleague Sayo to introduce our speaker.
Yeah, so I'm excited to introduce Dr. Stehman-Breen. She is the CEO at Chroma Medicine and also an advisor at Atlas Venture. She also serves as an independent board member at Generation Bio and Therapeutics and Dyne Therapeutics. She was previously the Chief Research and Development Officer at Obsidian Therapeutics, where she led discovery efforts for their engineered cell and gene therapies. And prior to that, Dr. Stehman-Breen was an entrepreneur in residence at Atlas Venture and a Chief Medical Officer at Sarepta Therapeutics. In addition, she's held various leadership roles at Regeneron and Amgen and received her MD from the University of Chicago and trained as a nephrologist and earned her master's in epidemiology at the University of Washington. So we're very excited today to have her join us to talk about her framework for defining unmet needs and platform indication selection. So I'll take this off and she could go ahead and share her slides. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. And first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to do this. It was actually a lot of fun putting a few slides together. And I actually didn't really know anything about biotech when I first joined biotech. And it really makes me incredibly excited and pleased that there's an opportunity for people to learn about the role that one can play in biotech, whether that's or pharma, whether that's actually joining or playing a role in academics. And so I think this is just a fantastic effort. So let me, since in an effort to not try to do two things at once and fail miserably, I am going to focus on sharing right now. Did that work? Okay, let me,
yeah.
Let me go to full screen mode. Did that work? All right, just a little quality check. All right, so today what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time talking about some of the key considerations for selecting indications for platform technologies. And I'll make a couple of comments about what that means when I say a platform technology. hopefully by the end, you'll have been given a bit of a framework for thinking about how to pair platform technology with either a lead indication or a set of indications, and a little bit of an understanding about how you can think through how to prioritize indications. There's a lot of diseases out there, and it can be really overwhelming as a platform company to try to pick which indication you want to start with. And then I want to say a little bit at the end about how you can leverage the expertise that you're getting as you go through medical school and residency in the context of a indication selection for a company. So let's start with what is indication selection. So when a biotech is formed, and particularly in my case, Chroma Medicine, which is an epigenetic editing company, when you create a company, when you form a company, you have to figure out how to showcase your technology. You also have to figure out how to validate your technology. So there's a couple of key things that you're doing as you're standing the company up. And so the good news is clinical acumen plays an incredibly important role very, very early on in company formation. So it's the process where you evaluate and then select either one or a set of indications that will show the unique value of the technology. Why spend a lot of money building a technology? So what that unique value is. It needs to address some unmet patient need, and it has to have a commercial opportunity, and they're all a bit interlinked. And so the goals are, again, as I said, to validate the technology, so show that the technology works. It helps, you do this indication selection also because it helps align and focus the entire organization on what to prioritize. There's some companies that will have lots of indications and lots of different tissues, and you can spend a lot of money not doing anything very well. And so it helps align everybody on the focus. And and in doing so, it helps you make better strategic and investment decisions. There's limited amount of capital to build a company. And so you really do need to know the most direct path from getting from A to B. And then it also importantly helps to inform what you may not be doing yourself, but might be very interesting for your technology. And you might have made certain decisions, and we can talk about that a little bit, as to why you might want to focus on a particular indication and not another one, even though that other indication might be quite interesting. Those indications are opportunities for one to partner, for example, with a larger biotech that might have capabilities and expertise that would be valuable for another set of indications. So it's a really, really important thing that you do early on. And as you're raising money, it's something that investors focus on a lot. So you can do indication selection in a number of different ways. We're going to talk about how you do it for a platform, but I thought it's useful to think about why and how it might be different in different types of companies. So a platform company is one that has a novel technology that can be applied to a host of different diseases. If you have a company that is focusing on a specific disease, so there are companies that just focus on cardiovascular disease, for example, they are agnostic as to the technology, they want to solve cardiovascular disease. That would be an example of a disease first. It's a little easier to do indication selection because you've narrowed that big white space down to just cardiovascular indications. And so here you're identifying a disease, you find drugs against either new or known targets that are relevant to that specific disease. And so the considerations are a little bit different than a platform company. It could be a pathway first. I worked on with a company when I was at Atlas Venture that was working on axonal degeneration, a very specific pathway that drove axonal degeneration. That also drives your indication selection because you're only going to be focusing on diseases where that pathway is relevant. So again, a lot less blue sky, and your value proposition is very much around that pathway. It could be drug first. There's companies that are repurposing generic drugs, for example, and there you'd be taking a drug and trying to think, where else could I use this drug? Or it could be that your drug has already been approved in a set of indications, and now you're looking for new indications. With a platform, what your platform company, what you're really looking for is to choose a disease that's going to specifically leverage the advantages of this platform, how this platform is going to solve a particular problem, and also has to be commercially relevant. So platform companies could be anything from a company that's specifically back in a little bit older days, it was an antibody company and that's all they focus on. So an example was Amgen, where I spent a number of years, or Regeneron. Now it could be a gene editing company, it could be a gene therapy company, or it could be a company that's focusing on degradation. And so it's focusing on a particular technology as its value proposition. So we're going to focus on platform companies. So let me talk a little bit about how you think about the indication selection process. And I found this actually in this article, where there's a link down here on the bottom of the slide. It's actually a pretty good article on indication selection for platform companies. And I thought it was a nice visual. So this lead indication, why is it so important? In a platform company, and in my opinion, it does two things. It has to validate the platform. And so you are trying to demonstrate that your technology works in a particular disease, but you have to first be able to demonstrate that the technology works. And that's really important when you're thinking about platform companies in your indication selection, because you don't, for example, want to choose an indication where you don't understand the biology. You get done with your experiments. If they don't work, you don't know if the platform doesn't work or you just didn't understand the biology. So you have to very cleanly be able to validate the platform. This is also important because it really narrows the white space down a lot for first indications, because you are going to have to understand the biology. You're going to have to understand, if it's a genomic medicine, if you can deliver it to a tissue, for example. And so these are good things because they do narrow down that white space and make it a little bit easier to pick your indications. You also have to demonstrate the unique value of the platform. So for example, if you are a gene replacement company, you are going to pick an indication where you are going to showcase the ability to replace a gene. And so, for example, maybe it's the dystrophin gene and Duchenne muscular dystrophy, so an area that's been very hard to tackle, where you can say, wow, if we could tackle this, look at the difference it would make in people's lives. And so you have to be able to differentiate the value of your platform, and also, differentiate your technology, but also validate the platform. So this is sort of what I'm talking about platform edge, and this is the terminology that this used. So what is your platform's unique capability? I gave the example of gene replacement. Chroma Medicines, an epigenetic editing company. We can alter gene regulation without cutting or nicking the DNA. So that's sort of our platform edge that we talk about. You have to know what problem you're trying to solve and how that platform can address the gap, and this will narrow your choices. You get asked over and over again, what is the one disease that you can tackle that nobody else can tackle? It's an almost unanswerable question for the most part, but that's kind of the mindset that you need to have in a platform company. And so, here I give a couple of examples. A nuclease that can do large insertions, and a delivery modality, or a delivery modality that can carry to large cargoes. So there you'd be thinking about gene replacement. Or you might have an antibody drug complex that can target tissues that are very hard to deliver to. You then go find tissues that are harder to deliver to, like the lung or the muscle, for example. So thinking about what that edge of your platform is the first step. So I talked a little bit about validating the platform as an early step, and I've touched on a few of these points. But for initial indications, what you really want to do is minimize the risk in a few areas so that you can very cleanly validate your technology. And so we talk about target tissue and translation. So translation means you understand biomarkers, they've been validated, they translate well from preclinical models to humans. You need to tissue is really, in genomic medicine, is really about delivery, and so you need to know that you can get to that tissue. And again, this gets back to that theme of if you're testing a new delivery technology and a new technology to edit genes, for example, and you have experiments that aren't working, you don't know what's gone wrong, and it's a much more difficult path if you've got multiple barriers. And so it allows this clarity of results as you are trying to reduce your technology to practice. And so here, another example, if you've got a novel gene editing approach, you're probably going to avoid tissues to begin with, tissues like lung, for which they are not validated, for which there aren't validated delivery modalities. Now, again, here, this is where business development can come in, where you might, there might be somebody that approaches you that's working on novel delivery technologies to, I don't know, the heart, for example, and you may say, okay, well, we're not going to do that internally. We're going to validate our platform, but maybe we'll do a business development partnership with somebody that has that a unique capability for which we are not going to build internally. So the good news is, just in thinking about what your edge is, and in thinking about validating the platform and demonstrating differentiation, you really narrow the world a lot. And so an example here, the world of diseases a lot. So here, an example in gene replacement, if your value proposition is to create a faulty DNA, but a segment of faulty DNA that could cure disease, then you're going to look at diseases where gene replacement cures disease and cannot be addressed by a similar approach. And so, and what I mean by that is, you're going to look for a disease where, in the absence of replacing the gene, you're probably not going to have an adequate cure. And Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a good example here. It's a very big gene, and there are other approaches that can mitigate. But if you can actually replace the gene that's faulty, then you can make just a tremendous impact, and you can talk about your value proposition. And you're also going to want a validated delivery technology. So I probably wouldn't have targeted muscle necessarily, because it's a little tough to target muscle with AAV and also lipid nanoparticles. So you're probably going to be thinking, okay, if I'm going to replace a gene, I'd probably target the liver, because lipid nanoparticles have been very well validated in the liver, or maybe the CNS, because we know we can deliver to the CNS with AAV. So let's talk a little bit about, okay, so I've narrowed my world down a little bit. There's still a lot of diseases out there. So there's a pretty simple framework that you can use to start interrogating which diseases might make sense. And they're based on two chunks, and I'll go through each of them. One is the scientific and clinical feasibility, and the other is more around the commercial viability of an indication. This is an example of a framework. They all look relatively similar, and my general experience is to kind of take that general framework and customize it a little bit for the company that you're doing this work for, because they'll have some specific nuances, particularly on the scientific and technical side, that you may want to consider. And so, from a science, so you can kind of break it down here into scientific, technical, understanding the disease, the ability to de-risk early, and then development considerations. And then you can see a set of considerations under here. And what you do is you work through these for every indication that you've narrowed it down to. You sort of interrogate those various indications based on these criteria. And it doesn't end up always being quite this rigorous in some ways, because some you'll take off the table right away, because you know they're not even going to. You don't even have to bother doing an entire worksheet, because you know that, for example, there are no decent biomarkers. And so you're just not even going to touch that disease. So if one kind of runs through this a bit, you can see that you absolutely need to have preclinical models that exist, and they recapitulate the disease. If you don't have that, your path is going to be a slow slog. And as an early biotech company, that's really not where you want to go. If you're working in a genomic medicine company, you're going to want to have a genetically defined population. But even if you're not working in a genomic medicine company, it can be extremely helpful knowing that if you make a certain change, then there's a human model of that alteration that recapitulates a benefit or a downside. And the development of the PCSK9 antibodies, for example, are a great example of that, or the sclerostin antibody for bone loss, where there were mutations that recapitulated what would happen, for example, if you either silenced a gene or used an antibody to decrease the amount of protein that was available. It's also important that you can demonstrate efficacy preclinically. So you want to have a good biomarker and the ability to test out the various iterations of your compound in the early space using preclinical models that have been validated, where you can measure efficacy and where there's good biomarkers in that preclinical space. You need to understand the disease. You need to understand what the natural history is of the disease. It's extremely helpful. If you don't understand the natural history of the disease, it can be difficult to understand how you can mitigate that disease with a therapeutic. And then some clinical validation within that condition. And so one of the other things that's just really, really important when you're thinking of, especially in small biotech, where you need to have these sort of early value inflection points where you can say, hey, look, my technology is really working, and there's a reason to believe that we can quickly translate this into humans. You need to have translatable biomarkers. And so if you think of, again, the PCSK9 antibodies, they were using LDL as a translatable biomarker. You can it is very easy to be able to translate changes in PCSK9 with changes in LDL cholesterol. Those changes in LDL cholesterol are well validated, translate from non-human primates into humans, and changes in LDL cholesterol are also translate well into cardiovascular risk reduction. It's sort of that perfect model. And it's why when you look at pipelines of companies, they tend to cluster on certain indications because there aren't that many really beautiful indications like that. The disease needs to have tractability. You need to be able to have the ability to interdict in that disease, and then have whatever pathway that you are trying to alter translate into clear changes in some clinical marker. You also, ease of clinical development execution is a super important one. And so a good example of this is Alzheimer's, right? I mean, we'd all like to be able to work in early Alzheimer's, but to do a clinical trial in early Alzheimer's would take an enormous study and would take forever to execute. Not great diseases. You want diseases where in your phase 1 data, you can very, very quickly look at a biomarker, know it's going to translate and it's going to easily translate. The study is relatively short. You know that there's not a lot of noise in your biomarkers, so you can use that same biomarker in your phase 2 study. You could have a relatively short phase 2 study using that biomarker, and then feel confident that as you're moving into your phase 3 study, it's very predictable. And so those are the sort of things that you want to think about in your ease of clinical development execution. You also want to balance, a lot of people will work in rare disease, and that can be great unless there are lots of companies working in rare disease. And then you're kind of looking for that needle in the haystack with this army of other companies that are doing the same thing. And it can be very difficult to find those patients. It could be that it's a disease where there hasn't been a groundswell of defining those patients, and so they can be trickier to find because they have to go through genotyping in order to identify those diseases. So there's a lot of challenges along the way in terms of your clinical development execution that you want to consider, both in the complexity and in the cost. I've mentioned time to observe evidence of biologic impact. You really don't want to pursue a disease that you've got to follow for a very long time to be able to have a clear biologic impact. And so that's another consideration as you're thinking through this. Time to IND, how much work is it going to take from the time that you start your preclinical studies, your IND enabling studies, the toxicology studies, the preclinical pharmacology studies? How long is it going to take from inception of, yes, we're going to target that, in the case of a genomic medicine company, a particular gene, to where we can have a development candidate, the particular therapeutic that you think you're going to move into patients, and then get through all of those clinical trials that are necessary, or or non-clinical studies that are necessary for you to be able to move into humans. That time period, you're spending a lot of money as you're trying to get into humans, and you want to be able to shorten that time frame as much as possible so that you're not having to raise money over and over again as you're trying to get from that standing the company up until you start getting into the clinic, which is a very important milestone for companies. And then I've mentioned some things around development, around patient recruitment. You want to be able to know where those patients are and have them have a call to action where there's an unmet medical need so that they're going to be motivated to join a clinical trial. You want to understand trial costs. They vary dramatically. Oncology studies can be very, very expensive. Studies in rare disease can be very expensive because sometimes you have to fly people to the sites. There's there can be a lot of complicated medical issues that can end up making the clinical trials very expensive. We talked a little bit about trial feasibility, and then validated endpoints. I can't stress this enough. It's very, very helpful to be able to give your investors confidence and frankly the medical community confidence that as you're generating data in phase 1, that there's a reason to believe that changes in a particular biomarker are going to translate to something very important for patients. It's important so that you can continue to have investors feel confident that they should be investing in your company. But as importantly, you need the physician community, you need the patient community to also think there's a reason to believe, so that they are those important participants in the clinical trial that ultimately will be what makes what will determine whether or not you have something of value at the end of your clinical trial program. So maybe just a quick example in a cell therapy example. You know that a disease cell might drive a particular disease. Destroying these cells could improve an outcome. You want to know it's safe. And there is a marker on the cell to target that's not expressed on normal cells. And so this is sort of a classic example of a CD19 CAR, for example, a really beautiful story that way. And frankly, one of the reasons that's been really tough for cell therapy to identify those unique markers on cells that aren't expressed on normal cells in areas like solid tumors, for example. So this is just a little bit of another picture of a framework that you can think about for how to think through how to weigh the various characteristics of a particular indication. And so here on the x-axis, you've got the development risk, and then you've got differentiation potential on the y-axis. This is really classic. The more differentiation potential you have, usually the higher development risk. And so you try to balance the two again so that you can show differentiation, but you don't have so much risk in development that it doesn't make a lot of sense to move forward. And so if you have a consultant come in and do some work for you, you often get these sort of nice figures that again, I think are just generally useful to use. And it helps the company to decide whether they're going to do a focus on something that's high risk, high reward. And you can see that in the upper right-hand corner, that are a great strategic fit, have huge differentiation potential, but can be very risky. And if you have a single product company, which is not typical of a platform company, this can mean the success or the death of a company. Platform companies, it's a little bit easier in some ways because usually you've got multiple shots on goal. And so you might want to pick a couple of the quadrants here. You might want to pick one where the development risk is modestly low, and where there's sort of moderate differentiation potential, but you think because the development risk is modestly low, you can clearly validate your platform, you can get there really quickly. And then you've got another indication or two that fall into some of these other quadrants where you're really willing to take on more risk. And so understanding what the end game is going to be for you as you're doing indication selection is important, so that you can say, okay, I'm going to pick one in this quadrant and a couple in this quadrant, and you can decide some of these things up front. All right, so commercial attractiveness. So this is another really important component as you're thinking through indication selection. And although it says commercial, it actually in many ways is very well thought through by physicians. And you know, I spent about 1.5 years at Atlas Venture, and most of what I did was help companies with indication selection. And I often wore this kind of quote commercial hat to be able to think through what sort of commercial opportunity there might be. And commercial opportunity generally falls into a couple of categories. You need to really understand the patient population. So this is where your skill set comes in incredibly handy. You have a good feel for what percentage of patients are not treated to goal. How much frustration is there amongst patients and physicians that there just aren't good therapeutics out there? If it's a pretty satisfied market, it's not that you can't go there, but it's a lot more work to convince people that you've got a tool that's going to be really needle moving. And you need to understand the incidence and prevalence. And so you can either pick rare diseases where there's an enormous amount of unmet medical need. Your therapy is pretty complicated. It's solving a big problem. And you can charge more to account for the development costs, or you can go to large diseases. The cost can be a lot lower for a particular therapeutic because of sheer numbers. And so that's where incidence and prevalence can come into play. Morbidity and mortality. So diseases that have significant morbidity or mortality, there's a higher call to action. Diseases that are symptomatic, a lot bigger call to action. And that's often because symptomatic diseases like pain, where there's chronic disability, big impacts on quality of life, a lot of complications, patients and their families are desperately looking for solutions. So they're going to their doctor saying, help me find something that can help my disease. I've churned through everything out there. Are there clinical trials available? And so you get a lot of push from the physician and the patient community. And this is pretty common in rare disease, but it's also common in generally in diseases with chronic disability. They're easier to develop than diseases that are silent, but ultimately can be deadly, like hyperlipidemia, for example. And then the competition, is it a best in class opportunity? Is this an efficacy play? Are you trying to differentiate on safety? It's always easier to differentiate on efficacy. Safety's tricky unless there's a major safety issue that's a huge hurdle. And in being a huge hurdle is actually impacting efficacy. The number of drugs that are marketed or in the pipeline, especially if you think that they're solving the same problem that you think that your technology is going to solve. And then, and as I noted, understanding whether or not they have the same mechanism of action. So these are all really important considerations in commercial attractiveness. And then finally, another really key component is strategic alignment. And so you have to really think about what the mission and vision of the company is. And this can be when you start really narrowing that funnel and you've got a few diseases left and you're trying to weigh the pros and cons of diseases, it's really important to think about what the strategy of the company is. The company has to be out there telling the story of who it is, what the vision and the mission is of that company, and how these indications are consistent with the vision and the mission and ultimately the overall corporate strategy. And so if you're and it can be easy at a platform company to want to solve everything. And you really can't do that, especially as an early company. You need to leverage your own internal capabilities and build internal capabilities, but you also have to be able to willing to share some of your children that you're developing with others that have complementary expertise. And so, for example, so gene editing or genomic medicine is a good example, and I could give an example from Chroma. you can develop drugs both in vivo and ex vivo. So you could work in cell therapy, you can work in vivo indications, for example, in the liver or CNS. It's very difficult to be both of those things at the same time. And so understanding what the company's vision is for how you're going to build the company, how you're going to define yourself, can also really narrow indications, because you decide you're not going to be everything to everybody, at least within your own company. And this is particularly important as one's thinking about capability build. So you can imagine if you come up with 3 different indications, one's in the CNS, one's in the liver, and one's in the muscle. You now have to build, and those are all in vivo indications, let's say. So you've kind of narrowed at least delivery to in vivo, and you're taking off the plate cell therapy. You are still going to have to bring in research, discovery, research, preclinical, clinical capabilities in 3 different tissues. And it's really no different than, when you're going and seeing a specialist. You're probably, if you get diagnosed with a particular disease like multiple sclerosis, you're not going to want to probably go see the dermatologist to help you with your multiple sclerosis. And it's the same thing in a biotech company. You have to build very specific expertise for every tissue you're developing. It's almost like medical departments or scientific departments. And so you really want to think about what therapeutic areas that you want to build, because it's going to have a big impact on your company and your capability build, and therefore getting that strategic alignment around where you're going to play is important. So when thinking about indication selection, so figuring that, and it's a little bit of iterative, right? You might sort of come up with a set of indications and say, hey, there's a bunch that are really clustering in CNS. And so maybe we should double down on CNS, and we'll deprioritize, or we'll partner some of these other indications because they're not going to be in our sweet spot, but we really think they'd be cool for our technology. Let's go find somebody that's got a lot of deep expertise in liver, for example, and we'll do a partnership with them for those indications. So even the indications that you're not pursuing internally can be very important to think through in indication selection. And one other thing that I think is also a good learning is, as you're picking your first indications, you also want to think about, what can I learn from that indication that will help build my platform? What insights will I learn about our technology if I'm building a technology that's focusing on targeting liver targets, for example? How can I translate that to other liver targets? How can I translate that to CNS targets? And so there can be real advantages to particular indications that can help unlock other indications in the future. And as I've mentioned throughout, the indications that aren't prioritized, you don't have to be sad about those. And I say that a little bit in jest, but I tell you, there are indications that are, near and dear to my heart, even here at Chroma, that we're not pursuing, but I desperately want to make sure that they get pursued, because I think our technology can make an enormous difference. And that's how some companies can get a little lost, because they start to try to pursue too many things, because they just don't want to leave something really interesting on a shelf. And so this is, again, where partnerships are really important. And so as one goes through indication selections, you say, okay, not right for our company, but I've done my diligence on this indication. It's something really cool for the technology. Let's put that in a partnering bucket. So partnerships are very important. And I think it's useful just touching on why they're important for a few reasons. One, they can generate money to be able to help fund your company, but that's actually probably the least important reason to do partnerships for an early company. They enable you to build new capabilities. So if we do a partnership with a company that's got deep expertise in, pick a tissue, in lung, and we don't have any expertise in lung, we can learn a lot from that partnership as we're sort of along for the ride, and we can make decisions along the way. Hey, maybe someday we think that we might want to be a lung company. And so you can gain important internal expertise, and also defray a decision about whether you want to build that now versus later, and defray some of the cost of that build. And so really important from that perspective. And it can give you access to other things that you need. So if you're working in genomic medicine, manufacturing is an enormous cost. And so you may not want to build manufacturing capabilities to do multiple things like cell therapy or in vivo targeting. And the manufacturing capabilities are very different if you're in CNS and you're building an AAV capability versus liver and you're building a lipid nanoparticle capability. But you could potentially partner with somebody that that's perhaps like a large pharmaceutical company that's got an AAV or a lipid nanoparticle capability that you can then leverage. And so it can give you access to infrastructure that you don't want to build yourself. So lots of good reasons to partner. And again, another really important reason as you're going through indication selection to think about those ones that you want to put on the parking lot for business development. And then finally, other ones that aren't prioritized, you might say, okay, we really think this is a cool indication for us. It's not in our first wave of indications because it's super important for us to validate the technology. This one's got a little bit too much biology risk and might make it confusing. But once we validate the technology, we're willing to take that biology risk on. So that's going to be in our second wave of indications. So you kind of put it on, in the pot of second round of indications. So I'm going to spend a couple more minutes now just telling you what the process looks like. And then I'm going to walk through a few templates that if you're ever doing some of this work might come in handy and maybe tell you a little bit why they're useful. So there's always a process around indication selection. It usually looks kind of like this. It takes a few months. You sit down and you align on what your strategy and those criteria that I showed you. And part of this process is everybody's got to hold hands on what is a ideal indication look like. And you'd be surprised at how valuable this is and how unaligned folks can be. It's a very crystallizing part of the work. And then you start trying to filter your indications. And I've got a slide, I think a little bit later or maybe it's the next one, that will make just a couple of comments on how you filter your indications. This is still tough because there's a world of diseases out there. You don't have every one of them in your head. And there's a few different ways that that one can do this. But you do want to start filtering those indications by the criteria that we ran through. And then organize them by the relevance to your technology and the various other criteria as you go through that funnel. And then you got to sit down and you got to start evaluating and prioritizing the list. This is usually fun, but a fair amount of work to really start being able to stare very critically into the pros and cons. And then you want to go make sure you're not drinking your own Kool-Aid. You go out and you go talk to a lot of experts and validate whether your thinking actually makes sense. And so usually during this process, you've identified experts in particular areas. And this is where academic physicians end up an area that they often have a fair amount of involvement. You get an email that says, hey, I work for X company. We've got this cool technology. We're thinking of developing in cardiovascular disease. We know you've got some great experience here. Would you mind getting on a call with us? Often that will lead to another call and some consulting work. And it's a very, very important component of thinking through indication selection is really pressure testing whether the unmet medical need you think there is actually truly an unmet medical need in clinical practice. And this is really important in companies that don't have physicians in them, and most early companies don't. And then finally, you need to finalize your recommendations. You're going to go and review it with your scientific advisory board if you have one in your board of directors before you get the stamp of approval. And when you get that stamp of approval, that's what sort of unleashes the resources to be able to pursue those indications. Excuse me. So an important process, it usually takes a little while, but it is a very important first step in a company that is a real maturing component of a company. And then you typically revisit this every year or two to make sure that the indications that you've chosen to begin with still make sense, nothing's changed, and to think through other waves of indications. So I mentioned there's a couple of approaches, and there's more than really a couple for trying to think about how to fill your funnel. So you can either take a top-down or a bottoms-up approach. Bottoms-up is more, you can use a bioinformatic approach. You can, like if you're working in genomic medicine, you can take a very long list of genetic diseases, You can create some criteria around those genetic diseases. And those can be anything from it has to have a certain prevalence. It needs to be in a particular therapeutic area. But that's part of that alignment work up front, is to figure out how you're going to start narrowing down that large set of diseases in a very big universe. There's other ways of doing this. You can also say, there's a lot of smart companies out there. I need to validate my technology. I don't really need to boil the ocean out there, or I'm not going to start by boiling the ocean. I'm going to start looking around and seeing what other companies are doing that are working in similar spaces, that are trying to do sort of similar things, and see what they've targeted. Sometimes you can also ask, what did they not target? And that can be an area of differentiation. You can talk to experts. If you're working in genomic medicines, you can talk to geneticists, you can talk to physicians with a particular expertise, whether it's, if you're a nephrology company, talk to a bunch of nephrologists, and you can get an understanding of you can tell them a little bit about your technology, and you can start getting lists of diseases that you then want to run through your filter and pressure test with all of those criteria. You can look in the literature. So there are other ways of doing this. I'm sort of a fan of doing both. It can be overwhelming to take a bottoms-up approach if you don't have, especially outside of genomic medicine, if you don't have good ways of filtering. And sometimes you end up with the same answer that you would with a top-down approach. And a top-down approach can often be a bit less work. If you do both, if you have the opportunity to that, you can kind of triangulate between the two. So let me just run through in the last couple of minutes here. Let me run through some of the tools that I've used for decision-making and a little bit of some rationale for why I've used them. So it can be, there's a lot of information. It can be really useful to organize some information. So this is just an example that I used a while ago. So I don't know, US payer costs may not be accurate anymore, nor even the treatment overview. I just lifted this from something I had, but it gives you a bit of an idea for PNH, how you might want to think about organizing some of the criteria, whether it's a condition overview, a treatment overview. So a little bit about the disease, the epidemiology, is it symptomatic? And remember, you're probably going to be talking to somebody that really isn't, it's not a clinician as you're going through the indication selection process. So there's a process of also educating and being able to provide some digestible information that, by the way, can then be lifted and used in a slide deck later around what the age of onset is, what the symptoms look like, the epidemiology, et cetera. This all then fades or funnels in later to some of that decision-making in that matrix that I showed you early on. It's also nice to be able to narrow it down to something even more specific. And so here you can see in some work in complement in PNH, a little bit more of a condensed version of what the profile is, how many patients are out there, a reminder of the mechanism of disease so that you can, think, so it's a trigger to think through whether your technology is a good one to address this. Platform rationale, depending on your technology, that would feed into that. A little bit about the clinical presentation and why there's an opportunity there. If you can de-risk through biomarkers, the available drugs aren't necessarily effective, and there's still a lot of people in this case requiring transfusion. So this is your value proposition, and then what the risk might be in terms of in this case, if there's a lot of competitors in this space, it might make your clinical trial program challenging. And so again, just some information that helps to consolidate the diseases, because you'll go through a lot of them and you'll have forgotten where you started by the time you get to the end. And so I think it's very helpful. Another thing that's really, really useful is to develop a target product profile. And I didn't fill this one out here, but it gives you an outline of what you generally would see. So an indication. So this is the X drug is going to be indicated for the treatment of use hyperlipidemia in patients who have established cardiovascular disease and have failed standard of care. So it's what you would see in a product label. It's important to think about this because it really does narrow down what your patient population is, particularly if it's a large patient population. Really important. What are your success criteria going to be? And this is helpful again in thinking about how long is it going to take to get there and how hard is it going to be in your preclinical studies. And this is where you partner with the folks at the company in the preclinical group. They'd sort of fill in what those preclinical efficacy pieces are. You're going to think about clinical efficacy. What's going to be compelling in a phase 1 study to move on? What's going to be compelling in a phase 3 study? Because that's ultimately what your label is going to look like. And if the clinical trial isn't showing a big enough impact on disease in a clinical criteria that anyone cares about in a time frame that's going to be reasonable, then it's not going to be a great indication. Safety is important too. If you have a disease that's very common, that people are pretty healthy, you've got to be squeaky clean. If you're working in oncology, you may be able to accept some safety signals, and thinking through these early on, super important. And then how are you going to administer it? Is it IV? Is it once a month? Is it twice a day? These are important, especially as you're thinking about your competitors. This is another little tool that I've used in the past where you can organize some of the technical and development paths for disease. You don't necessarily fill all this on all of this in early. I've sanitized this slide a little bit, but it's working in neurologic diseases, and as you can see, it's working in a degenerative eye disease. And so here you can see you're thinking about the target biology, a reminder of the biology and why this is important, what you need to show from a preclinical validation standpoint, and then importantly, how you can de-risk it. You don't necessarily need to use all of these templates, but they can be important as you're thinking through how you're going to organize your thinking. And then finally, well, I've got a couple more, but this is a really important one. You're going to have to stack up your indications apples to apples. And so this is a way of listing your indications and then categorizing them by either it's positive, there's some concerns, are very challenging, and you start creating this matrix, and you're like, wow, that one's got a lot of red, or that one's got a lot of green, and then you have to sort of think through what you're willing to compromise on. And so, if you've got a lot of green for development feasibility, ability to de-risk early, scientific rationale, and commercial opportunity, but it's super competitive, you may say, I'm willing to deal with that competitive environment because maybe we think that we're going to make that big of an impact. But again, it's a way of being able to compare across your indications as you're starting to narrow them down, and a way of visualizing to the ultimate decision makers. This is another good one. There's lots of drugs that are in development, and you're many, many years from getting in the clinic when you first start. And so it's helpful to organize where various companies are in development so that you can make sure that you're going to be competitive by the time you get to clinic. So again, another way you can organize that information. So I'm going to close the presentation here and just, again, summarize that it's an incredibly important activity, one that needs to be done very early in the build of a company, where clinical input can make or break a company, and an important opportunity for folks, whether or not you want to join a company and provide that input, or do some consulting work for a company and provide that important input. I've had both medical students and residents help during this process, and it can be just a really fun activity to participate in.
Thank you so much. This was incredible. It was super helpful to get kind of your broad understanding of the space, but then to drill down and give us actual frameworks of things to fill out and work towards if some people take advantage of those opportunities that you're discussing. We have incredible questions, and many of them, so we'll get through as many as we can. And Catherine, you let us know when you have to go. But to start off, there's a number of questions around Chroma, and depending on what you can share. So we'll start with this of, what do you think is Chroma's platform advantage? And then how does that play into what diseases you guys are choosing to go after?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're an epigenetic editing company, and so we have technology that allows us to regulate gene expression very specifically. So we can very specifically target genes, and we can regulate that gene expression without cutting or nicking the DNA. And so part of our value proposition is we don't cut or nick the DNA. And when you cut or nick the DNA, you can have downstream consequences like translocations. And those consequences can be oncogenic, for example. And so we don't make any changes to the DNA sequence. And so that's a value proposition. So where can that be important? So we can actually change the expression of multiple genes at once, so we can multiplex. And if you're multiplexing, for example, with a gene editing technology, you increase your risk of translocations. And so it's an area that we can probably more safely play in than a gene editing company. So there's a value proposition there. We also, when we silence a gene, we completely silence a gene. If you're using a gene editing approach and you're silencing a gene, then that gene is actually not completely silent. It's still making a gene product. That gene product could be immunogenic. It could have off-target effects. And so it's leveraging an endogenous system. It's leveraging a very highly evolved, highly conserved system. And there's something very attractive about leveraging something that's evolved over millions and millions of years, just in terms of knowing that when you are silencing a gene, it's leveraging a system that's very highly conserved. And so we try to choose indications that first validate the platform. And so we look at indications where we know we can deliver to the tissue. There's validated delivery approaches where we understand the biology, where we've got good biomarkers, and we really and where we can multiplex. And so that's another area that we focus on. So all of the indications that we've selected to date are in multiplexed, where we're taking a multiplexed approach.
Really interesting. There's another few questions around
Sure.
a similar theme, so I'll try to combine this, but some people reference gene editing companies and gene therapy companies that are often targeting the same indications, sometimes related to delivery mechanisms being best to certain tissue types like liver. And so how does this trend for you matter as a CEO? Do you think it's inevitable that all companies are in this space are going to target the same thing? Do you think there's value in kind of going against the grain?
So it's a really good question. There is generally a cluster for technology companies or platform companies to target, particularly as it relates to delivery, tissues you can deliver to. It's very risky to try to target it, to stack too many layers of risk. It's just you're developing a new technology, and there's a lot you learn as you're developing that technology, in addition to a lot of biology. For us, we've learned a lot about the epigenome as we've been developing this technology, and if you confuse that with you can't get it to the tissue, it can take a lot longer for you to develop your drug, and so or to develop your technology and your drug. And so I do think that initial indications will generally cluster in areas where you can minimize risk outside of your technology. With all of that said, there are so many biotechs out there doing so many different things right now. There's companies that are just focusing on delivery to hard to reach tissues. And so as you're unlocking your technology, you're looking at these companies that can deliver to tissues that are tough to deliver to. And you're like, these are companies that we want to partner with. We either want to in-license their technology. We're willing to take that risk because now we know the technology works. Now we can start applying it to areas that are have other key risks, because we're not layering those two risks on top of each other. And so there's a little bit of patience that has to happen. Now, as companies that are developing delivery technology start unlocking tissues, then you can go directly to those tissues. And I think we'll start unlocking larger spaces. It is somewhat heartbreaking as a physician to sort of know that a lot of the novel technologies are being developed in clusters of spaces, and it feels like there's other diseases that are and therapeutic areas that are being left behind. I don't think that that's a permanent problem. I think it's right now. It's just there's just been so many advances in in this space in genomic medicine that delivery just hasn't quite caught up yet. But I have huge confidence that it will.
Yeah, it's definitely very exciting, but also crowded space, which hopefully is good for patients. Yeah. And yeah, I agree. Hope that delivery catches up soon. Perhaps we'll switch and maybe end on a note, career note. Someone asked, what's a challenge you faced while transitioning from being a physician to working in industry?
When you first join industry, about 20% of what you know is transferable, and the rest of it isn't super transferable. And so you've got this incredible skill set that you bring, but it almost feels a little bit like starting over again. Activities like this, I think, will change that. And I think the more that people that are interested in drug development can get insights a little bit earlier and get training a little bit earlier, the more tools you'll feel like you have when you join industry. But it's just there's an enormous learning curve, just enormous. And there's just also a lot of functions, especially if you join a larger company, that just don't exist and you don't know anything about it. It took me probably 6 months to understand, maybe even longer, how commercial was organized. I didn't know the difference between global commercial and there's just lots of capabilities that you have very little experience and exposure to, that you have to work in a very matrixed environment and learn how all of these pieces fit together. And that's a big learning curve early on.
That is good to hear that there's a lot to learn still, but also awesome to hear how you see how you've your career has grown and developed. I'm trying to look and see at the other questions and if there's one or two more, if you have time to answer, because there's some really interesting ones here. Another theme that's coming up is about characterizing unmet needs. So one person was asking, how do you analyze the patient need in a crowded space like cancer, or particularly what resources to leverage for this type of research? Are there databases or favorite tools that you have?
So it depends a little bit. So if it's an area that you're familiar with, then you have a better feeling. So if you've done training in internal medicine, you've got a much better feel for a number of the different specialties. What's really hard is when you're working outside of your area of expertise, like ophthalmology. For me, I'm starting from scratch if I'm looking at indications in ophthalmology. And what I always do is I tend to start by just gathering data. And so you pull some review articles. You have to educate yourself in a space that you're not all that familiar with. So you pick some basic review articles, educate yourself a little bit. Once you feel like you're not going to sound like you have no idea what you're talking about, then you do start going out and talking to physicians that work in the space. And usually you develop a sort of a standard set of questions that you run through. You have a few slides on your technology. You run through that. You give them some ideas about how you're thinking, and you get some feedback. But it's really a data gathering exercise to understand whether what you're reading. There's always reviews on unmet medical need in particular diseases, right? And so you kind of like, I don't know, you're not fluent in German and now you've got to go be fluent, right? You're going to make some errors when you're using your high school German in Germany. So you kind of go and you're not sounding all that sharp and you're bumbling along a little bit, trying to ask questions and get yourself educated. But the more you talk to physicians, you'll be really surprised at how relatively easy it is to pick up most areas well enough to get a good feeling for unmet medical need. I'm a nephrologist. I've worked in a lot of different therapeutic areas. I built a neuroscience group at Amgen. I hadn't thought about psychiatry since I was in college. And, you do all the same stuff you do in medical school and residency. You just start reading and talking and asking a lot of questions. You'd be surprised at how much strength and how much what a transferable skill set that you learn during your training and practice, frankly, in being able to really quickly sort of unlock areas that you didn't know much about. By the way, you also know way more than anybody else. When you're working at a small company, there's usually isn't another physician, and people think you're a little bit magical in your ability to talk clinical. And so it is actually pretty gratifying too. People are incredibly grateful for the expertise you bring. And so it's pretty fun for people to really think that you're making a big impact, particularly in companies early on. So it's pretty fun.
I love this theme that you're mentioning about lifelong learning, but then also that I think in medicine, we often, we lean on other experts, and we often don't feel like we are experts consulting other services or things like that. And so knowing that you have value in the expertise that you do bring, but also, again, talking to colleagues and leaning on others. Maybe we'll have time for one more question. Let me just take a look here. We've got some really interesting ones. Or why don't we do this? So how do you balance the distribution of resources and capital to the advancement of various programs? Focusing on one lead program versus expanding to a breadth. What considerations underlie these decisions?
Some of it depends on the kind of company you are. And so if you're a platform company, you're almost always going to have multiple. You're going to pursue multiple diseases so that you can really showcase the technology. There's many companies though that are single indications. They're betting on one pathway and maybe two diseases, and so some of it is just the strategy and the philosophy of the company when it started. So usually, single indication companies are usually being built. They're usually being built to ultimately get purchased by a larger pharmaceutical company, where you showcase some cool technology that maybe came out of, or a cool pathway discovery that came out of academics, and you want to be able to apply it. And you're not going to build a entire company out of a pathway, but a pharmaceutical company might think that's really cool. We'd love to add a new therapeutic in that pathway to an area that we've got expertise in. We're going to build it. And so some of it is just the philosophy of the company, and that will to a large extent determine even just how much capital you're able to generate. Once you know what kind of company you're going to be, if you're a company that is really just trying to build and then ultimately get acquired, you're probably going to be you're going to probably use your resources really wisely, and not that we don't all use it wisely, but you're probably going to be extremely careful and much more limited in the capability builds that you're going to do, because you're not necessarily expecting to go to multiple therapeutic areas, for example. If you're a platform company, it's a lot harder, because there often is just an enormous amount of space that you can apply your or a number of diseases you can apply your technology to. And so you have to make some hard decisions. And some of it is just, how much of a capability build is it in manufacturing, let's say, and are we willing to trade off that enormous manufacturing build to not do other things in another area that may better showcase the technology, maybe lower hanging fruit in terms of being able to quickly validate the technology and show differentiation, or even to be able to hit or address multiple diseases. And so a lot of it is just sort of, how much am I going to spend to be able to develop that breadth versus how much how many diseases are we going to be able to touch? How much will it help us showcase the technology to be able to attract investors to further invest in the company? So a lot of it's just sort of risk benefit. And again, takes a lot of early strategic decisions to make some of those decisions, which can be hard decisions. Again, there can be things that you're like, oh my God, I really want to pursue this disease, and it may be the only disease in a particular therapeutic area for which your technology makes sense. You're way better off partnering something like that than building an entire therapeutic area capability to address one disease when you could partner it with another company that's got a lot of deep expertise in that space. So those are a couple of examples of how you think about prioritizing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think with a lot of things, it really seems to be about striking a balance versus risk and development potential and that kind of thing. Yeah, thank you for all the insights. I think I could speak for all of us when I say that we definitely learned a lot and took away a lot from what you've shared. And we really appreciate you taking the time to give us your tidbits of wisdom on this topic.
Great. I'm always happy to answer other questions too. So if anyone wants to send me a note on LinkedIn, I can send you my email address, or you can give them my email address, and always happy to answer any other questions.
Great, thank you. And I guess right before, thank you.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say right before we close things out officially, I do want to let people know that we're going to be having a follow-up session on this. Our second session focused on biomarkers and translational medicine. That's a topic that actually came up quite often during your talk, and thinking about how biomarkers could be used in the development of a drug candidate and sort of expediting the process. And so our speaker will be John Wagner. He's the CMO at Kinetica. And we're looking forward to having you join us for this second event. So you could RSVP at the link below, and additional information will be sent out soon afterwards. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.